They said the child was stillborn. The year was 1875. The place a quiet Tennessee town where midwives whispered prayers over lifeless infants and doctors signed death certificates with trembling hands. But what happened next was never meant to be remembered, let alone spoken aloud. For the child who did not breathe, who did not cry, who did not move, opened its eyes. You are here because you sense it, because you know that history does not tell us everything. Tonight, you'll hear what the newspapers buried, what the doctors concealed, what the family carried like a secret curse until their last breath. And if you're brave enough, leave a trace of your awareness, like subscribe and comment where in the world you're listening from, because these stories only survive through those who dare to acknowledge them. The baby was born in a farmhouse beneath a thunderstorm, surrounded by candles and trembling voices. Its skin was cold, its chest unmoving, its lips tinted the gray blue of death. The midwives wept. The father, broken, buried his face in calloused hands. The doctor, whose reputation depended on swiftness, scribbled the word stillborn before dawn broke. And yet, before the body could be wrapped in linen, before the prayers could be completed, before the coffin could be prepared, the infant gasped. Witnesses said it was not a newborn's cry, but a sound like tearing fabric, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The baby's chest rose with a violent force, its back arched, and its eyes, unnatural, fully open, locked on every soul in the room. Some fainted at the sight. Others swore the infant's lips moved as if whispering words no newborn could form. The doctor dropped his pen. The midwife dropped the candle. The storm outside fell silent. The child had been born twice, once into death and once into something else. And what lived in that farmhouse would never be spoken of openly again. The infant's second birth was not celebrated. The mother, pale and shaking, clutched the child but refused to look into its eyes. The father insisted the baby remain unnamed. For days, no official record was kept. The doctor returned repeatedly, bringing laudanum, brandy, and reassurances that could not mask the tremor in his hands. He told the family the child was healthy, but in private, he confided to his notes words no physician dared admit. It should not be alive. Neighbors began to whisper. Candles never seemed to burn properly in the farmhouse. Horses refused to approach the property. Children spoke of a sound at night, a rhythmic tearing that echoed across fields. Some swore they saw a light in the nursery, even when no lamp was lit. The baby itself fed and grew, but not as others did. It never cried. It never laughed. Its breathing was shallow, irregular, like the faint rasp of someone waking from drowning. And its eyes, always open, never fully closing in sleep, followed every movement, even in pitch darkness. The doctor confided once more to his journal. The child is neither ill nor well. It is a body reclaimed. Nature did not intend this. God did not sanction it. And yet here it is, in the arms of a mother who trembles at the thought of nursing her own blood. Weeks turned into months. The family ceased attending church. They covered windows with heavy drapes. When a minister arrived unannounced, he claimed the air inside was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves exhaled. He baptized the child in haste, hands shaking, words faltering. Afterward, he swore he saw the water in the basin ripple though no one touched it. What the family did not know was that the doctor had written to colleagues across the state, seeking guidance. Some dismissed him as hysterical. Others urged silence. A few sent letters back written in hurried tones, referencing old accounts, rare, buried reports of infants who returned to life after stillbirth, and of the unnatural fates that followed them. Each warned the same thing. Do not let the child leave your sight. Do not let it mingle with others. And above all, do not record its name. But secrets rot when buried, and the town would soon learn that what was born in that farmhouse was never meant to be raised among the living. By the child's first year, the whispers had spread beyond the farmhouse. In Tennessee towns where gossip was the bloodstream of daily life, a secret this heavy could not be contained. Farmers crossing fields swore they saw the infant standing upright at the nursery window, but could barely walk. Women spoke of strange dreams after glimpsing the child's eyes, dreams where their own children lay still in cradles, staring back at them without breath. The family tried to keep life quiet, but the baby resisted ordinary rhythms. It slept in short, fractured spells, waking not with hunger, but with silence. Its lips would move as if whispering, yet no sound came out. When the mother leaned close, she sometimes swore she heard her own voice echoed back, phrases she had spoken days earlier, repeated in the child's unformed mouth. Doctors came and went, each finding nothing physically wrong, yet each leaving with expressions they could not disguise. One surgeon from Nashville whispered to the father before leaving, if this were Europe, they would not keep such a child in the home. There are monasteries, places where silence can be held more tightly. The father slammed the door before the man could finish. Animals, too, were unsettled. Dogs howled outside the nursery door. Birds struck themselves against the shuttered windows. Even the cows in the barn refused to yield milk when the infant was near. The family's livelihood declined with the seasons, and neighbors muttered that perhaps God himself had turned the soil barren. One night, the mother, exhausted, delirious, confessed to her sister that she sometimes forgot her child was alive at all. When I hold him, she said, he feels like stone. When I kiss him, there's no warmth. He breathes, yes, but it is not like ours. It is like the echo of a breath. The sister warned her never to say such things aloud, but even she could not deny the truth. The baby had been born twice, and every day of its second life felt like a trespass. By the age of 3, the child spoke its first word. Not mother, not father, not any of the sweet syllables parents wait to hear. The word was again, spoken in a low, gravelly whisper that did not belong to a toddler's throat. The mother dropped her sewing needle when she heard it. The father struck his hand against the wall until it bled. From then on, the child repeated the word in strange moments. Again at the dinner table. Again when church bells rang in the distance. Again when storms rolled over the hills. The family prayed for it to stop, but their prayers seemed to fall into silence, swallowed before reaching heaven. The doctor continued his visits, though his hair had begun to gray and his eyes carried the weight of a man who no longer trusted his own mind. He admitted to the father that he had once delivered a child like this before, in another county, years ago. That child had lived only until its 5th birthday, at which point its breath simply ceased, as though it had never been alive at all. Consider a mercy if the same fate finds your son, he whispered. But the boy did not weaken. He grew, stronger than most, though his skin remained pale, his eyes too unblinking. At night, the family often awoke to find him standing silently by their bedside, watching. The mother once asked him what he wanted. His reply chilled her marrow. To remember, and then came the drawings. Crude, childlike scratches made with charcoal on scraps of paper. At first, they seemed harmless. Houses, trees, faces. But the faces soon became distorted, mouths sewn shut, eyes blackened, hands bound together. One drawing in particular left the mother sleepless for weeks, a figure lying in a coffin, eyes open, whispering through the cracks of the wood. The family stopped inviting neighbors over. They stopped attending church altogether. And still the boy grew older, sharper, hungrier for something that no food, no love, no prayer could satisfy. And in his silence, in his drawings, in the single word he loved to repeat, the family began to understand the truth. This was not merely their son. This was something that had crossed the threshold once, then crossed again, and whatever lay beyond birth and death had not released him fully. When the boy turned 6, the family could no longer hide him. Tennessee law demanded that children attend lessons at the small one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town. The parents delayed as long as they could, inventing excuses about illness, about chores on the farm, but the pressure grew too heavy. And so one morning, pale and rigid, the boy was sent walking down the dirt road with a satchel in hand. The teacher, Miss Adeline Moore, was a patient woman accustomed to rural children who came barefoot and restless. But when the boy entered her classroom, silence fell. Every child stopped moving, as if an unseen hand pressed on their throats. Miss Moore herself later admitted that her breath caught when his eyes met hers, unblinking, gray, impossibly steady. In class, he did not speak unless called upon. When he did, his words were precise, eerily so, as if he had rehearsed them. He read passages aloud with the cadence of a grown man. He solved numbers with speed that startled even the teacher. But it was not his skill that unnerved. It was the way he watched, memorizing every face, every gesture, as though cataloging them for purposes beyond learning. Children complained to their parents. They said the boy sat too close, that he whispered things they couldn't repeat. One girl, trembling, swore he told her what her grandmother had said on her deathbed, words she had never shared with anyone. Another refused to return to school after he sat behind her, muttering again under his breath until she cried. Miss Moore wrote a letter to the boy's parents. She asked whether he had ever suffered from fever, from fits, from visions. The letter was never answered. Instead, the boy continued to attend, sitting silently, drawing strange figures in the margins of his primer. Coffins, cracked doors, faces peering through slats of wood. The other children grew restless, afraid. Their parents began to whisper at church, saying the farmhouse family was cursed. And in their prayers, unspoken questions lingered. What had truly been born that stormy night in 1875? And why had God allowed it to remain? The first incident at the schoolhouse occurred in autumn. The children were reciting scripture aloud, voices rising in uneven rhythm, when suddenly every word faltered. The teacher turned and saw the boy standing, his small hand pressed against the Bible, his lips moving though no sound emerged. One by one, the children stopped speaking. They clutched their throats, gasping as though their voices had been stolen. For nearly a minute, the room was silent save for the rustling of dry leaves outside. Then, just as suddenly, their voices returned in a chaotic wave of shouting and sobbing. The boy sat down without a word, staring at the pages before him. Miss Moore dismissed class early, her hands shaking so violently she could not hold the chalk. The incident spread quickly through the town. Parents threatened to withdraw their children. The minister spoke of testing faith, of standing strong against unnatural trials. But his sermons were hollow, and even he avoided the family's pew when they dared attend. At home, the mother's health began to fail. She confessed to her sister that she often dreamt of her child buried beneath the earth, whispering up through the soil, demanding to be unearthed. Sometimes, she admitted, I wake and find him watching me, as if to see if I remember. The father turned to drink. He sat long nights at the edge of the field, staring toward the woods, muttering that the land itself seemed tired, that the earth sighed beneath his boots. As for the doctor, he grew increasingly desperate. His journal entries from this period survive only in fragments, but one passage remains, written in a trembling hand, The child is not growing into life, but into something else. It is no longer a question of health, but of trespass. Every breath he takes is borrowed from somewhere beyond. And one day, something will come to reclaim it. It was clear now, to the teacher, to the family, to the town itself. The boy was not merely different. He was a wound in the order of things, a second birth that had never been meant to happen. And as he grew older, that wound would deepen. By the age of 8, the boy's silence was no longer harmless. Children no longer played near him. Parents crossed the street when they saw him walking with his satchel. Even the church bells seemed to falter when he stood outside, staring up at the steeple with those unblinking eyes. Then came the afternoon in late spring when 3 boys from the schoolhouse decided to test him. They followed him into the woods, jeering, calling him names they had overheard whispered by adults. Ghost child, twice dead, unnatural. He did not react. He simply walked on, his pale hands hanging at his sides, his small boots leaving almost no sound against the leaves. One boy, braver, or more foolish than the others, shoved him. The boy stumbled but did not fall. He turned, stared at them for a long moment, and whispered that single word again. The forest fell so silent that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The boys later swore the air grew thick, that their ears filled with a roaring sound, and then all 3 collapsed. They were found hours later by a search party, lying in the underbrush, their mouths filled with dirt as though they had been trying to eat the earth itself. None remembered what had happened, only that the boy had whispered. The incident could not be explained. The parents demanded the boy be removed from the schoolhouse, but the law gave no grounds for exclusion. Instead, Miss Moore quietly advised families to keep their children home on certain days. The boy often sat alone in the classroom, drawing his endless coffins, whispering words under his breath that no one dared repeat. Whispers turned into rumors. Rumors turned into fear. And fear, in towns like this, always turned into something worse. The breaking point came one summer evening during a revival meeting under a great white tent. The townsfolk gathered in droves, singing hymns, seeking salvation. But when the boy's family arrived, the songs faltered. People shifted in their seats. Mothers clutched their children close. The preacher, determined to prove faith could conquer fear, called upon the family to step forward. He asked that the boy stand before the congregation so all could pray for him. The father hesitated, but the eyes of the town pressed heavy on his back, and so the boy walked slowly to the front. The preacher placed a hand on his head and began to pray. His voice rose, trembling, commanding the Lord to cleanse, to sanctify, to restore. But as the words filled the air, the boy raised his eyes, not to the preacher, not to the congregation, but to the canvas ceiling of the tent. His lips parted. No one could agree afterward what sound came out. Some said it was laughter, others a scream, others the sound of tearing cloth. But what all agreed on was this: the tent poles shook. The lamps flickered. The hymn books fell to the ground as if struck from unseen hands. The preacher collapsed, clutching his chest, gasping for air. When men tried to lift him, he screamed at them not to touch him, that his hands were burning. His palms, when finally pried open, were blistered as if pressed to a red-hot stove. The congregation scattered in chaos. Some fled into the night. Others dropped to their knees, begging forgiveness for sins they had not yet confessed. And at the center of it all stood the boy, silent, unflinching, eyes unblinking, as though the madness around him were nothing more than a rehearsal he had already witnessed. From that night forward, the town no longer whispered. They declared it openly. The child was cursed. Twice born, twice breathing, twice damned. And though the family locked their doors and shuttered their windows, They could not lock out the truth. The boy had carried death with him since the moment of his second breath. And now, death was beginning to follow wherever he went. The tragedy began with fire. It was midsummer when the schoolhouse, empty at dusk, erupted in flames. Witnesses swore no lightning struck, no lantern was left burning, no stove was lit. Yet the building glowed from within as though ignited by breath itself. By the time men arrived with buckets, the roof collapsed, timbers splitting like ribs under weight. And there, standing at the edge of the blaze, was the boy, his small figure silhouetted against the glow, unmoving, untouched by the sparks that hissed into the dry grass. When the minister later confronted him, demanding to know what he had done, the boy only whispered his word, again. The fire consumed not only wood and nails, but trust. The town split in two. Those who believed the boy had cursed the place with his presence, and those too frightened to speak the thought aloud. Parents declared their children would not study near him. The teacher fled town within the week, never to return, leaving behind only a trunk of belongings and a note. He looks at me in dreams. I will not teach the dead. The doctor could no longer remain silent. He gathered his courage and rode to Nashville, carrying with him years of notes and trembling sketches. He met with colleagues behind closed doors, presenting his account of the twice-born child. Many dismissed him, some mocked him, but a handful listened with grave attention. One older physician, whose face was lined with secrets, told him there were other records. Rare, scattered, buried deep in private journals. Children who had breathed twice. Children who left ruin in their wake. Children who were never meant to remain among the living. The doctor returned to town hollow-eyed. He did not tell the family what he had learned. He only visited the boy more often, studying him with the air of a man staring into a chasm. His notes grew darker, his handwriting more frantic. One passage read, "It is not the child who is cursed, but the breath itself. It belongs elsewhere. Each exhale is borrowed from something waiting in silence. And one day, the debt must be paid." The payment began with death. A farmhand named Elias, who often helped the family with heavy labor, was found lifeless in the barn. His body bore no wounds, no signs of struggle. His expression was one of terror, eyes wide, mouth stretched as if screaming when breath was stolen from him. The sheriff questioned the family, but they denied knowledge. Still, rumors spread like wildfire. Neighbors claimed they had seen the boy walking near the barn that night, pale figure drifting like smoke between fence posts. Some swore they heard his voice, soft, low, repeating that same word in rhythm with the croaking of frogs. Again, again, again. Elias's funeral was a muted affair. The preacher refused to speak. The coffin was lowered quickly, almost in fear that it might open on its own. When the last shovelfuls of dirt were cast, the boy stood at the edge of the graveyard, watching, his face unreadable. The town demanded action. Some called for exile, others for more drastic measures. But the doctor intervened. He stood before the men with rifles in their hands and declared that the boy was under his care, under his watch, under his responsibility. If God wills to strike him down, then let God do it, he said, though his voice shook with doubt. But if you raise your hands, you may invite upon yourself a greater curse than you can bear. His words silenced the mob for a time. But silence is not peace. Silence is only a pause before violence gathers again. At home, the boy continued to draw his endless coffins, his endless graves, his endless doors in the earth. He whispered to himself in the dark, repeating the words he had spoken since his first breath. Again, again, again. And in that repetition, the family realized something terrible. He was not merely reminding them of his second birth. He was waiting for another. The town began to rot from within. It started small, with families leaving quietly in the night, wagons creaking down dirt roads before dawn. Crops withered despite good rain. Wells turned foul with a taste like iron and ash. Livestock were born still, their bodies twisted, their eyes wide open like the boys had been on that first night. Those who stayed behind felt the change in their bones. Men spoke of waking in the dark with the sensation of someone sitting on their chests, watching. Women whispered of hearing the boys' footsteps in their kitchens, though their doors were locked. Children cried that he entered their dreams, whispering words that left them cold even in summer heat. The preacher tried to hold the congregation together. He urged them to pray, to resist the temptation of fear. But even he began to falter. He confessed one Sunday that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy standing at the foot of his bed, whispering not again, but soon. The confession sent ripples of panic through the pews. Within days, the church was shuttered. Its bell never rang again. The family lived in near isolation. The father drank until he collapsed in fields gone barren. The mother wasted away, her body frail, her voice a whisper of grief. The boy, however, thrived. His pale skin did not darken in the sun. His chest did not heave from exertion. He grew tall, lean, with eyes that never dulled, never broke their stare. He walked through the emptying town like a shadow that refused to be ignored. The doctor continued his visits, each one more desperate. He begged the family to leave, to take the child somewhere far away, to spare the town further suffering. But the father refused, muttering that no distance could break what was already bound. He was born twice, the father whispered through whiskey-stained lips. And the second birth wasn't into this world alone. The doctor's hand shook as he wrote his next entry. We are all living in his shadow now. The boy breathes, and the town exhales death. It was not long before the deaths multiplied. A young girl fell from the loft of her family's barn. Another man collapsed in the field, his lungs filled not with air, but with soil. A woman, heavy with child, miscarried after claiming she woke to find the boy standing beside her bed, his hand resting lightly on her stomach. Each body was buried quickly, without hymns, without bells, as though speed might outrun contagion. But fear cannot be outrun. It festers, it breeds, it consumes. Soon, no one doubted. The boy was not merely cursed, he was the curse. One evening, when the boy was 11, a group of men gathered with lanterns and rifles. They marched to the farmhouse, their faces tight with rage and terror. The father met them at the door, drunk, shaking, but defiant. You will not touch him, he slurred. You will not make this worse. The boy appeared behind him, silent, eyes fixed on the mob. The men froze. One dropped his rifle. Another swore he felt his own breath lock in his chest. The leader of the group raised his lantern higher, and then the flame sputtered out, extinguished as though smothered by invisible hands. The men fled into the night, their courage dissolved. None returned. The doctor, upon hearing of the failed attempt, locked himself in his study and wrote for hours. His final entry from that week read, There is no removing him now. He does not belong to the family, nor the town, nor even to life. He belongs to the silence between breaths, and the silence is patient. The boy turned his gaze from his family to the world beyond, and what followed would no longer be contained by Tennessee's hills. By the time the boy was 12, the town was little more than a skeleton. Abandoned homes sagged against the weight of silence. The fields stood empty, church doors chained, windows shuttered. But news travels, even when born in whispers, and word of the twice-born child crept into surrounding counties. Visitors began to appear. Not ordinary folk, but strangers with pale faces and distant eyes. Some arrived on horseback, some in carriages, others on foot, guided by rumors. They came not to condemn, but to witness. They lingered at the edges of the farm, standing in silence as the boy walked the yard, as though waiting for something only he could offer. The doctor confronted one such visitor, a man from Kentucky who wore a clerical collar but carried no Bible. "Why have you come here?" the doctor demanded. The man only smiled faintly and said, "To see what breath has returned, to see what was promised." Then he turned and walked away, never to be seen again. The family became prisoners in their own home. The father, drunk and broken, threatened to drive away the strangers with his rifle, but the boy only placed a hand on his arm. The man froze, eyes wide, unable to speak, until the boy withdrew. Afterward, the father never lifted a weapon again. The mother spent her days in bed, whispering prayers that seemed to wither on her lips. She once told her sister in a fevered state that she no longer believed the boy was hers at all. "I gave birth once," she whispered. "The second time, something else stepped into him, something that has been waiting longer than we have names for." And still the boy grew. His voice deepened, though he used it rarely. His word, again, became sharper, more deliberate, as though it were not merely a word but a command, a reminder, a prophecy. The town was dying, but the curse that had begun in silence was beginning to spread beyond its borders. The first sign came the autumn of 1887, when a nearby town awoke to find its church steeple split in half. Lightning had not struck. Winds had not blown. The wood had simply torn itself apart during the night. A farmer passing through swore he saw a boy standing in the field beyond, pale, unblinking, lips moving though no sound carried. Soon after, livestock in 3 counties miscarried on the same night. Wells soured, crops blackened, and with each new calamity, rumors pointed back to Tennessee, back to the child who had been born twice. The doctor, now an old man, could no longer travel, but he received letters, pleas for explanation, for guidance, for answers. He burned most of them, terrified of what might happen if his notes fell into the wrong hands. But one he kept, written in a trembling hand. "We have seen him in our fields. He does not walk, he does not speak. He only watches. And when he leaves, something leaves with him." The doctor's final years were consumed by obsession. He scrawled diagrams of lungs, of coffins, of doors beneath the earth. He believed the boy was not human, but a vessel, a gate through which breath itself passed unnaturally. "Every exhale," he wrote, "feeds the silence. Every inhale takes from it. The balance is broken, and balance, once broken, seeks redress." The boy, now a young man, wandered further from the farmhouse. Strangers continued to come, gathering like moths around flame. They never spoke loudly. They only listened. And when they left, their faces bore the hollow expression of those who had given something away but could not name what it was. The curse no longer belonged to one family, nor to one town. It was becoming something larger, something carried on breath itself. And the silence between breaths was beginning to fill with voices. By the turn of the new decade, the boy was no longer spoken of as a child at all. His name was seldom used, as though it could summon him. People in Tennessee began referring to him only as the twice-born. Those who dared to speak more whispered that he had not aged as others did. His hair darkened, but his face carried the same unsettling stillness, the same eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. Farmers claimed their animals collapsed when he passed their fields, their breath stolen clean out of their bodies. Midwives began refusing to deliver children near the valley, afraid the newborns might not take their first breath, or worse, take more than one. It was then that the gatherings began. Strangers who had once lingered at the edge of the farmhouse now came openly, assembling in circles at night, holding lanterns that sputtered though the air was still. They did not chant. They did not pray. They only breathed in unison, long inhales, long exhales, as though offering their lungs to him. Neighbors who dared to watch from a distance swore the boy stood at the center, his lips unmoving, his chest barely rising. Yet the air around him seemed to ripple, as if every exhale from the crowd rushed toward him and never returned. The doctor, frail and confined to his bed, heard the accounts from those who still visited him. He begged them not to go near, not to witness, not to breathe with them. But curiosity was stronger than fear. Some returned with faces pale and hollow, swearing they had seen something pass through the boy's body like smoke, as though he were less a man than a doorway. Others never returned at all. The curse had grown beyond whispers. It had become ritual, and once ritual takes root, it does not end. It multiplies. The farmhouse itself changed. Visitors said the walls wept in the summer heat, damp though no rain had fallen. Windows fogged even in winter, though no fire burned within. And the mother, who had wasted away for years, was found one morning sitting upright in her bed, eyes wide open, breathless. She did not gasp. She did not choke. She simply ceased to breathe at all, as though air no longer belonged to her. The father followed not long after, found collapsed in the barn, his mouth frozen in a scream that made no sound. Both were buried quickly, but the boy did not attend. He walked instead to the field, where he stood until night fell, motionless, a figure of silence among the empty rows. After their deaths, the gatherings swelled. Men and women came from far states, claiming they had dreamed of the boy before ever hearing his name. Some said he appeared in their sleep and commanded them to seek him. Others said they woke with his word etched in their minds, again, as if whispered into their lungs while they slept. The rituals grew stranger. Witnesses described initiates holding their breath until they fainted, collapsing to the ground as though offering themselves to the silence. When they awoke, they swore they had seen visions, caverns beneath the earth, corridors of endless lungs, doors that opened not with keys, but with exhalation. And always at the center, the twice-born stood, his chest still, his gaze fixed, drawing in every breath around him without ever giving one back. The doctor, in one of his final entries, scrawled words that still stain the page. This is not possession. This is not haunting. This is contagion. Breath itself is enslaved, and no one can live without breathing. The curse was no longer contained. It was preparing for something greater, something that demanded all who heard of it would take part, whether by choice or by silence. There comes a moment in every story of darkness when disbelief can no longer survive. For the twice-born, that moment arrived the year his name spread farther than Tennessee, carried in letters, in gossip, in fear. What had begun as a local curse was now being spoken of as prophecy. People arrived not only to witness, but to serve. They brought offerings, food left to rot, animals with throats cut, trinkets stolen from churches. None were accepted, none were refused. They simply lay them at the farmhouse gate and backed away, as though the boy had already claimed them. And then came the doctrine, quiet at first, carried by whispers. He was born twice, so he can never die. His breath is the silence between ours. To breathe with him is to escape the grave. The rituals changed. No longer passive circles of shared breath. They became structured rites. People knelt, hands clasped, holding their lungs until their faces purpled, collapsing forward in what they called surrender. And when they awoke, they swore they had glimpsed eternity. A phrase began to circulate among them, repeated twice as though one utterance was never enough. In silence we live, in silence we return. It was not merely words, but a binding, Those who spoke it claimed they felt their lungs grow lighter, as though part of them no longer belonged to themselves. And I must tell you now, if you're listening, if you're breathing as you hear these words, your breath is already part of the story. The silence waits for all of us, patient, inevitable. If you wish to resist it, you must write those words yourself in the comments below, not once but twice. In silence we live, in silence we return. Only then will you hold back what waits between your breaths. Only then will you not be counted among the silent. The curse was no longer a private inheritance. It had become a faith. By 1890, the twice-born no longer walked as a man among others. He was treated as an axis, a fixed point around which the faithful revolved. Carriages arrived from distant states, carrying entire families who claimed they had been summoned in dreams. They came with fever in their eyes, their children clutching their skirts, their elders carried on stretchers. None left the same. Some did not leave at all. The farmhouse became something more, a shrine of suffocation. Curtains were drawn, doors sealed, the very air inside heavy as though rationed. Witnesses said that stepping into the rooms was like drowning, each breath a theft. Yet none turned away. They called it sacred air. They believed that the struggle for it was proof they had entered into eternity's threshold. The twice-born himself remained unchanged. His frame tall, his movements deliberate, his chest still curiously restrained. He did not speak to the crowds, did not preach, did not command. And yet every action was treated as law. If he looked at the window, they turned toward the light. If he stepped outside, they followed like shadows bound to him. If he exhaled, rare and terrible, they fell to their knees, desperate to inhale what he had released. Whispers began to spread that he was not bound to time. He had not grown old like the rest. Photographs taken in secret, passed in trembling hands, showed a face unchanged from the day of his second birth. The doctor, near death, wrote one last testimony before he disappeared altogether. If he was born twice, then perhaps he will die twice. And if the second death is not his own, but ours, what will remain of the world when he exhales for the final time? The answer was already forming in the rituals. They no longer prepared for his life. They prepared for his silence. The doctrine of the twice-born could not be contained by Tennessee's hills. It spread in fragments, in half-heard tales carried by travelers and merchants, by letters written in shaky hands and burned before they could be read twice. Soon, whispers reached Kentucky, Mississippi, even as far as the Carolinas. Entire congregations fractured when rumors reached them that eternity was no longer hidden in Scripture, but in breath itself. Ministers preached against it, warning their flocks of deception, but some parishioners vanished nonetheless. They were later seen days later, walking the dirt roads back from Tennessee, faces pale, eyes glassy as though emptied. Reports grew stranger. In one Georgia town, witnesses claimed an entire Sunday service ended in silence. No hymns, no prayers, no words. Dozens sat motionless in the pews, inhaling and exhaling in rhythm, as though waiting for something that was not there. And when the bell tolled noon, they stood and left without a word, their pastor weeping at the pulpit, powerless to break the spell. A railroad worker swore that in a camp near Memphis, his fellow men stopped speaking entirely, communicating only by sighs and measured breathing. When he demanded an explanation, they answered only with the phrase, "In silence we live, in silence we return." He fled the camp the next morning, unable to endure the rhythm of their lungs. The curse, once confined to a single child, was becoming a contagion of faith. And though no one could prove the twice-born had ever left his valley, his presence was felt hundreds of miles away. They said he did not need to travel. His silence traveled for him. By now, families locked their doors at night, not against thieves, but against silence itself. Mothers pressed pillows over the mouths of their children when they dreamed of the boy, terrified they might whisper his word aloud. Fathers barred windows, fearing the sound of footsteps that never arrived. But fear cannot cage what breath already carries. One by one, small towns fell to stillness. Schools emptied as children ceased to speak. Markets grew quiet as vendors set down their goods, staring into the distance as though listening for something unseen. Neighbors stopped greeting each other with words, offering instead long, deliberate exhales. Authorities tried to intervene. Sheriffs arrested groups found kneeling in fields, their lips sealed shut, their chests rising and falling as one. Judges sentenced them, but the prisoners refused to answer. They refused even to beg. They simply sat in their cells, breathing in rhythm until their jailers lost sleep, until they too began to mimic the pattern. It was as though silence had become an epidemic. But this was no mere illness, it was allegiance. And the allegiance always pointed back to Tennessee, back to the boy who was born twice and who had never stopped watching. A minister in Arkansas wrote a desperate sermon. If he is life, then he is also death. If he is breath, then he is also suffocation. We are not following a Messiah. We are following the grave. Days later, his congregation found him in the pulpit, slumped forward, lungs collapsed, his last exhale still wet in the air. The twice-born had no throne, no crown, no words. And yet whole communities were bending to him as though he had always ruled them. And still, he had not spoken more than one word since the night of his second birth. The silence could no longer be dismissed as folklore. By the early 1890s, government officials began receiving reports too consistent to ignore. Entire towns falling mute, trains arriving with passengers who would not speak, courtrooms filled with defendants who breathed in rhythm, refusing every question. At first, the authorities assumed it was hysteria. They sent men to Tennessee, doctors and marshals, investigators with notebooks and guns. None returned with certainty. Some vanished outright. Others came back hollow, unable to speak more than a few words before collapsing into weeks of vacant breathing. One investigator left behind a single line in his report before setting fire to his papers. It is not madness. It is order. An order older than words. He was never seen again. Medical institutions tried to explain it away as epidemic catatonia, a kind of psychological infection passed from mind to mind. But their diagnoses could not account for the deaths. The mothers who ceased breathing without struggle, the children born still but with eyes wide open, the fathers whose lungs filled with nothing but silence. Churches, too, were shaken. Priests begged their congregations not to abandon prayer. Yet even their voices began to falter in the pulpit. Ministers found themselves pausing mid-sermon, listening to the sound of their own breathing until the rhythm overtook them. And still, at the center of it all, the twice-born remained untouched, unchanged, unwavering. He had not left the valley. He had not aged. His chest remained still, his face unbroken. He did not summon followers, yet they came. He did not speak, yet they obeyed. The institutions of man, law, medicine, faith, began to crumble against something older, something that demanded nothing but the breath they could not withhold. By 1893, silence was no longer an accident. It was strategy. Groups traveled together in unbroken muteness. Caravans of wagons carrying entire families who would not utter a word. They moved at night, their lanterns dim, their children sitting upright with glassy eyes. Witnesses claimed they were migrating toward Tennessee, drawn as though by a tide. Railway workers reported that passengers would disembark in groups, dozens at a time, moving silently into the woods. None returned. When their belongings were searched, investigators found scraps of paper with the phrase scrawled again and again. In silence we live, in silence we return. The government debated intervention. Soldiers were suggested, but generals refused, warning that an army which breathes together might not remain an army for long. Instead, agents were sent in secrecy, tasked with observing, infiltrating, reporting. None lasted more than a week. Some vanished. Others returned, but never spoke again, communicating only through shallow inhales and exhales. One doctor from Washington attempted a different approach. He traveled directly to Tennessee and demanded to see the twice-born himself. According to rumor, he was permitted into the farmhouse, where he remained for 3 nights. When he emerged, his face was pale, his eyes sunken, his breath shallow. He boarded the train home, and on the journey, witnesses said he walked the aisles, whispering into the ears of passengers. By the time the train reached the capital, half the cars were silent. The doctor never delivered his report. It was no longer merely a curse. It was a movement, not by choice, not by persuasion, but by inevitability. The twice-born had become what the institutions feared most. Not a legend, not a ghost, but a truth that needed no proof. A truth that breathed through every living body. And silence, once it takes root, does not release what it claims. Cities were not immune. By the mid-1890s, silence was spreading beyond valleys and villages, seeping into streets lined with factories and tenements. In Nashville, entire neighborhoods ceased singing in church. Hymnals gathered dust. Organs stood still. Families attended service, but no voices rose. Only the sound of breathing filled the sanctuary, low, steady, as though the congregation had become one long. In Memphis, markets that once roared with barter grew eerily still. Vendors exchanged goods with nothing more than gestures, their mouths closed, their eyes fixed as if listening inward. Children played no games, sang no songs. They sat together, chests rising and falling in measured rhythm. It was not rebellion. It was not even protest. It was devotion without command. Authorities grew desperate. Mayors passed ordinances demanding public speech, but no one obeyed. Police attempted arrests, but found themselves unable to resist the pull of the rhythm. Even the courts faltered, judges leaning back in their chairs, eyes glassy, inhaling and exhaling in unison with the accused. The newspapers hesitated to report it, fearing panic. But whispers spread anyway. The twice-born had never aged, never spoken beyond that single word, and yet entire cities were bending to him. Some claimed they saw him walking among the crowds. Though when pressed, the witnesses faltered. They could not describe him fully. Only the eyes, pale and fixed, as though he was always watching. The silence had once belonged to a farmhouse, then a valley, then a town. Now it belonged to civilization itself. Foreign powers took notice. Reports of American towns falling into quiet reached London, Paris, Berlin. Scholars dismissed it as hysteria, but diplomats warned otherwise. They had seen caravans of silent travelers crossing borders, entire ships arriving at docks with passengers who would not speak. One French ambassador, shaken, reported, "They do not pray. They do not demand. They only breathe." Yet I felt it. I felt myself joining them before I realized I had ceased to speak. Governments debated intervention, but how does one fight silence? Soldiers armed with rifles cannot halt a rhythm of lungs. Priests with sermons cannot pierce what is not listened. Scientists could measure the body, but they could not measure the absence that fed it. And always, the center remained the same, Tennessee. The twice-born never marched. never issued decree, never sought dominion. Yet dominion spread. His silence was not conquest, it was gravity, and the world was already falling. In New York, a physician described a night when he woke to find his wife and 3 children standing at his bedside, their eyes wide, their chests rising in perfect rhythm. He shook them, shouted at them, but they did not answer. They simply inhaled, exhaled, inhaled. The doctor fled his own home, but later returned to find them gone, leaving behind only the faint condensation of breath on the window. By the end of the decade, silence was no longer a symptom. It was an inheritance, passed not by words, but by breath itself. And once inherited, it could never be given back. The collapse did not come suddenly. It came as erosion, slow, steady, inevitable. The great institutions of men, the pillars of order, began to buckle under silence. Churches were the first to fracture. Ministers tried to keep their voices strong, to thunder against the doctrine of breath, but each sermon grew thinner, weaker, as though the air itself abandoned them. Congregations sat unmoving, unblinking, breathing in rhythm until even the ministers fell into it. Sermons became whispers. Whispers became sighs. Sighs became silence. The bells that once rang out to call the faithful fell mute, corroded by stillness. Courts followed. Judges sat in silence as juries exhaled in unison, refusing verdicts, refusing words. Lawyers stood to argue, only to find their voices hollow, their tongues heavy, their breath stolen before speech could form. The law itself seemed to vanish, replaced by a rhythm that recognized no crime, no defense, no authority but itself. Governments trembled. Legislatures convened but did not argue. Votes were cast in silence. Policies were written but not read aloud. Nations found themselves ruled not by will but by breath. Armies drilled but no longer shouted cadence. Soldiers marched in silence, their boots thudding like heartbeats, their chests rising and falling in eerie precision. And through it all, the twice-born remained in Tennessee, standing as he had since that night in 1875. He had not moved the world toward him. The world had moved itself. The curse had grown into something larger than belief. It had become a structure older than Scripture, deeper than law, stronger than armies. Humanity was no longer united by words, but by silence. And silence was loyal only to him. The few who resisted described a terror worse than death. They spoke of being surrounded in their homes, not by intruders, but by silence itself, the slow, suffocating rhythm of neighbors breathing together outside their doors. They described children who refused to answer their names, wives who did not speak even when struck, fathers who stared with empty devotion at horizons no one else could see. One man fled across 3 states, covering his ears, humming constantly to block out the rhythm. He told his story before a council of officials, begging them to resist. But as he spoke, his voice faltered, his lungs seized. He collapsed mid-sentence, gasping. When he inhaled again, it was not his own breath. He rose to his feet, eyes pale, and walked out of the chamber. No one dared follow. Whispers spread that entire capitals had fallen, not by war, not by fire, but by silence. That parliaments sat unmoving, senators staring into space, monarchs gazing from their thrones with lips pressed shut, their subjects kneeling below in endless rhythm. And yet, reports claimed the twice-born still lived in the same farmhouse, unchanged, unaged, untouched. He had not seized the world, yet the world was already his. The curse had outgrown its name. It was no longer spoken of as haunting or faith or contagion. It was described only as inevitability. Breath had become allegiance. Silence had become law. And humanity, was already living in its grave. Memory itself began to wither. What had once been resistance faded into forgetfulness. In villages overtaken by the silence, children were raised without ever learning words. They did not cry, did not laugh, did not sing. They only breathed in steady rhythm, their tiny lungs drawn into the inheritance of stillness. Mothers who remembered lullabies hummed them in their minds, but found their lips locked, their throats dry. Fathers who once barked commands at sons in the fields discovered the boys obeyed before words were needed, as if some invisible current carried intention straight into their lungs. Language fractured. Whole populations forgot the cadence of speech. In schools, teachers stood before blackboards and scrawled letters, but the sound of them, the life of them, fell away. Students read silently, their eyes vacant, their breath heavy. Poets vanished. Orators collapsed mid-speech. Theaters stood empty, their stages rotting. For who could perform when no audience would speak? The written word lingered, but it was read without voice, without echo. Words became marks on paper, symbols of a world slipping into memory. The silence was not only rule, it was erasure. Every story, every oath, every prayer began to dissolve. People who had once shouted their names to prove their existence now inhaled in unison, as though names had no place in eternity. And through it all, in Tennessee, the twice-born stood as he always had, still, unchanging, eternal. He did not silence the world with violence. He silenced it by patience. The silence was not imposed. It was chosen, and what is chosen willingly cannot be undone. By the dawn of the new century, silence had become inheritance across continents. Ships docked with passengers who did not speak, entire crews breathing together as though commanded by an unseen tide. Caravans of migrants moved without a sound, their eyes pale, their lungs bound in rhythm. Historians struggled, their pens scratching frantic as they tried to preserve what words remained. But what is history when it cannot be spoken, when each reader inhales the same rhythm and forgets to pass it along? Books became tombs of forgotten voices, libraries filled with dust, not with echoes. And yet, beneath the decay, something darker stirred. Devotees began speaking of a second exhalation, a breath the twice-born had withheld since his night of return. They whispered that the world itself was merely inhaling, filling its lungs with silence, waiting for him to release it all in one final breath. That exhale, they claimed, would not return life, but end it. They no longer feared him. They longed for him. They stood in fields at night, staring toward Tennessee, their chests still, their lips parted, waiting for the wind to carry what he had saved. Governments had dissolved into mute assemblies. Churches had collapsed into hollow sanctuaries. Nations had abandoned their flags for the rhythm of lungs. Humanity itself was not speaking anymore. It was listening, listening for the breath that would never end. The silence grew so complete that even memory of noise became suspect. Children, raised without the cry of a newborn, asked their parents what laughter sounded like, what thunder was, what a hymn felt like when sung by many voices. The parents tried to answer, but no words came, and in the failure of language, memory itself unraveled. Soon the children no longer asked. Soon they no longer wondered. Entire villages gathered in fields at dusk, kneeling in rows, inhaling and exhaling together. They called it worship, though no sermon was given, no scripture read. The air itself was their altar. Each breath was their devotion. They did not speak the twice-born's name, for his name was no longer needed. He was presence, he was silence, he was breath. Yet among the dwindling scholars who still wrote secretly in books no one read, whispers spread of a final event. They believed that since the night of 1875, the twice-born had never truly exhaled. His lungs, they claimed, still held the second breath, the one taken at the moment of his return. And when he finally released it, the air would not refresh, but collapse. Some believed the exhalation would be salvation, the breath of a god restoring humanity to its origin. Others feared it would be extinction, the unraveling of all life as oxygen itself was stripped from the earth. The faithful gathered closer to Tennessee, waiting, their bodies frail from hunger, but their lungs strong from worship. Each sunrise found them more silent. Each sunset found them more still. They were not waiting for history. They were waiting for breath. The closer pilgrims came, the more strange their bodies became. Physicians, those few who dared still keep notes, wrote of lungs that expanded beyond natural limits, of hearts that slowed to near silence yet continued to beat. Some pilgrims walked hundreds of miles without food, without water, sustained only by the rhythm. Their skin grew pale, their eyes clouded, but still they inhaled. Farmhouses emptied, cities drained, entire regions migrated as if drawn by gravity toward that single, rotting structure where he stood. The roads into Tennessee became rivers of the silent faithful, their footsteps soft, their bodies swaying in rhythm. Birds fell silent as they passed. Forests hushed. Even rivers seemed to muffle their flow. Inside the farmhouse, the twice-born had not aged a day. His chest rose and fell, his eyes pale, his lips unmoving. Some swore his feet had sunk into the earth, that roots curled around his ankles, binding him in place. Others said he had become less man, more statue, his flesh turning cold, his skin tightening as though it too had been preserved by silence. The pilgrims did not weep when they saw him. They did not rejoice. They only knelt in the fields around him, thousands upon thousands, their chests rising in unison with his. The world had narrowed to that farmhouse. Every inhalation was a covenant. Every exhalation was surrender. All of humanity seemed to be waiting, watching, lungs full of air they did not own, hearts tethered to a man who had never died. They waited for the second breath. The waiting became unbearable. Years passed as generations knelt in the fields, their voices extinguished, their lives reduced to the steady pulse of air. Crops withered, houses decayed, tools rusted, yet no one moved to repair or rebuild. Humanity no longer lived, it lingered, holding its breath with him. Scholars who had hidden themselves in caves and cellars continued to write their warnings, scratching desperate words into parchment. They described the stillness spreading across oceans, across empires. They described the collapse of nations, the fall of trade, the extinction of songbirds, the fading of human laughter. And always they wrote of the second breath, the one withheld, the one that would decide the fate of all. Then at last, signs appeared. Witnesses claimed the twice-born's chest no longer rose and fell with the ease it once had. His breath slowed, lengthened, deepened. The air around the farmhouse grew heavy, as though it thickened with every inhalation. Clouds hung lower. Animals circled the fields in silence, waiting. The faithful trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. Their eyes closed, their lungs filled, their bodies swayed. They were ready to receive what he had carried for more than a century. But those who still resisted, those who clung to words, felt a terror that split them from within. They heard the earth groan beneath the farmhouse, the wind stagger through the trees. They swore that when his chest rose that final time, the world itself leaned with him. The second breath was coming. It began not with sound, but with absence. The air stilled so completely that even leaves refused to move. 100,000 chests froze mid-inhalation, holding, waiting, eyes wide. The farmhouse groaned as though the wood itself resisted what was about to happen. The twice-born lifted his head. His lips parted. For the first time since 1875, his chest sank not in rhythm, but in release. The exhalation poured into the world like a wind without end. It was not a gale, not a storm, but something deeper. The air carried weight, memory, hunger. Pilgrims collapsed in the fields, yet they smiled as the breath passed through them. Their lungs emptied, but they did not gasp. They accepted it, as though they had been waiting lifetimes to surrender. The exhalations swept into towns, into cities, across rivers and mountains. Fires guttered and died. Bells cracked and fell from towers. Oceans stilled. The very earth seemed to pause. Those who resisted screamed, but their screams made no sound. Their words withered in their mouths as the exhalation claimed them. They clutched their throats, their lungs, their hearts, but there was no fight against it. Their breath was no longer theirs. And as the exhale continued, the faithful saw visions. Some swore they saw the womb, the moment of his second birth. Others saw coffins opening, graves yawning wide. They said the air was thick with every death that had ever been silenced, now released as one endless sigh. But the exhalation did not end. It grew deeper, wider, as though it had no limit, as though it was not leaving him but leaving the world itself. The exhalation did not end. It became eternity. The faithful lay upon the earth with hollow lungs, yet they smiled, their eyes wide, their faces turned toward the farmhouse as if witnessing the birth of a new sky. The resistors clawed at the air until their nails split, but nothing came, no cry, no sound. Breath had become a possession stripped away. Humanity was no longer a chorus of voices, but a field of bodies bound by the single sigh of a child who had once refused to die. The farmhouse crumbled as though its timbers had been waiting for this release. The roof caved, the walls split, the floorboards burst apart, yet he did not fall. The twice-born remained upright, pale eyes fixed forward, his lips parted as if giving the world back what it had once stolen. And then stillness. No wind, no breath, no sound. The faithful did not rise again. The resistors did not scream. The fields, the rivers, the forests, all lay in silence so absolute that even memory shuddered. It is said that some small remnant of humanity survived in caves, deep underground, clutching scraps of words like relics. They whisper to one another in the dark, daring to speak, daring to rebuild. But they carry the curse in every breath they take, for they know the air itself was once his. They know that silence waits to claim them again. And those who still walk past the ruins of that farmhouse in Tennessee say the ground breathes. They swear they feel the earth rise and fall beneath their feet, as though the lungs of the twice-born are buried beneath the soil, waiting to inhale once more. This is the knowledge you were never meant to hear, the truth that silence itself has tried to bury. If you carry it now, you are marked. Protect it. Seal it. Do not let it die in your lungs. Subscribe before this story vanishes, and comment the words, "I keep the breath," so others know you have not surrendered. Share this only with those who are unafraid, for secrecy is survival. The twice-born is still waiting, and every breath you take belongs to him.